Are you muted, maybe? No? Is it just me? Oh.
Good morning, everybody.
I can hear Colin. Good morning, Colin. Are you muted? We can't hear maybe? Amy. No? Is it just me?
Can't hear Amy. Nope.
Oh.
Good morning, everybody.
I can hear Colin. Good morning, Colin. Are you muted? We can't hear Amy.
Lovely to see everyone's smiling faces here.
Hello.
Hi, Stephen.
Hey, good morning, Stephen. Or good afternoon, good evening, I guess.
Yes, midnight, just past midnight.
Yeah.
Thank you for staying up late. We appreciate it.
No problem.
And it looks like you've got some guitars back there. Maybe while we wait, you could play us a few songs.
Yes, I do. I do play music for almost 20 years now.
Wow, that's great. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Still can't hear you. And it always works. You're always good.
I like that Amy's outside so as not to wake up anybody sleeping inside.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you, Amy.
Okay. All right. Did I accidentally end the meeting for everybody?
You did.
Dang
well,
it. Okay.
It fixed your audio, whatever you did. So.
Okay. All right. Hey, Stephen, are you there?
Yes. No.
Hey, so I got your Telegram message. As far as translations go, do you think the Chinese or the EMAC community would watch this or not?
I don't know. I don't think so. They're having a meeting right now, actually. So
yeah, I know. I didn't know that.
I think they're going to join later. Some of them are going to join later.
Okay. And how about this? Sorry?
Well, you're just saying most of them, they do speak English. So.
Oh, they do?
Yeah. Oh. When we interview the volunteer, we actually...
You don't have to translate it then.
Cool.
Okay, that's fine then. Cool. That's easier for you too.
Yeah.
Poor Orchid had to translate Korean yesterday, and I feel like all this stuff is very dense. So I was like, oh my gosh, I feel bad for her. Okay, well, it's 7 past the hour. Do you want to get started? Colin, are you there?
I am here. Yeah. I just want to make sure that my audio stays stable. So let me know if the quality of my transmission goes down, and then maybe I'll kill the video. You guys know how handsome I am now.
Sounds good. All right. Well, hi, everybody. This is another in our series of community calls. Today's call is with Colin Boole. He has a very long and distinguished career in online dispute resolution. I cannot even begin to do justice to his background. So I'm basically going to let him introduce himself.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. Well, hi, everybody. Yeah, as Amy mentioned, my work is in online dispute resolution, so resolving disputes between people over the internet. I worked at eBay and PayPal for 8 years, resolving disputes in that marketplace, and then spun out a company from eBay called Modria that did online dispute resolution in a wide variety of different areas. Now you can see my new affiliation is with Tyler. They bought my company last year. So we build dispute resolution, online dispute resolution processes for the courts. So I've written a book called Online Dispute Resolution for Business, and I wrote another book last year for the ABA called The New Handshake, Online Dispute Resolution in the Future of Consumer Protection. So I'm affiliated with the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. I'm co-chair of the advisory board there. That's based at UMass Amherst. But yeah, this is what I do. Use the technology to resolve disputes. So I think that's why Amy brought me into this conversation.
Fantastic. And just so you know, this session is being live streamed and it will be posted on YouTube. So let's go ahead and get started. Colin, I know you have great answers to all of these questions, but let's start out with the basics, right? Right now in the EOS community, there are debates going on as to whether or not we even want a dispute resolution or arbitration base layer. And what that means is, unless someone prior to entering into a smart contract or prior to transacting on the EOS network specifically opts in to having some sort of dispute resolution mechanism, I mean, if they don't have it, then basically if something goes sideways, they are out of luck. And so there's a debate going on right now about, well, do we even want to have this catch-all? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on that. This is very interesting. I've seen this conversation play out many times. For e-commerce companies, for marketplaces, for anytime somebody sets up a large system, they say, well, it's going to be complicated to deal with all these disputes. Do we really need to do that? And I think there is an appeal to sort of this libertarian attitude, which is, well, just buyer beware. People will get into these relationships. If a problem arises, that's kind of their own responsibility. I remember I went to a conference, gosh, this would have been 1995 or 96. And they were talking about how the new mechanisms that we were building into electronic contracting, this was really hot at the time, just securing a traditional contract, but using technology to do it. They said, we have so many levels of assurance built in that there are not going to be any more disputes. Technology is going to eliminate disputes. And the father of online dispute resolution, a guy named Ethan Catch, he was in the audience sitting next to me, and he stood up and said, pardon me for being so rude here, but the power of technology to resolve disputes is dwarfed by the power of technology to generate new disputes. And I think that it is true when you set up a large system like this, it's inevitable that there are going to be disputes. The question is, what percentage of the transactions will generate a dispute? Now, what I've seen is healthy marketplaces generate usually 1% to 3% of transactions will generate a dispute. And a lot of those disputes are readily resolvable. It's just a misunderstanding. It's something that wasn't specifically called out in the contract. It's an edge case. Things that just weren't thought through. And 3% dispute rate, you think, well, that's not that bad. Parties can just handle that. But I've also seen a lot of marketplaces and a lot of payment providers undone by that 3%, because the ill will that's generated by the 3% essentially undermines trust in the overall marketplace. So, again, it doesn't have to be a heavy-duty system. I mean, if it turns out, in fact, that the dispute rate is much higher than 3%, you can just set up a protocol that essentially provides an infrastructure for people to resolve their own disputes, as opposed to getting involved in every single one and providing arbitration. But if you don't provide any mechanism like that, what happens is you significantly undermine trust in the environment, and that means people will find more trusted alternatives. So, I think that this is not necessarily a first order. When you're trying to set something up like EOS from scratch, the main things you think about, your top 10 list, dispute resolution may not even be in the top 10. But as you start to knock out some of those top priorities, I think dispute resolution quickly rises up. And I think it can be a powerful competitive differentiator for EOS versus the other virtual currency networks. But I am biased in the fact that I put a lot of time and energy into this. I consulted with Airbnb when they first started out, and they said, we're not going to build a dispute resolution process. We're just going to let the parties figure it out, until they had 2 or 3 really huge, high-profile, bad disputes that went sideways. And then they were like, oh, man, we really need to put time and energy into this. And then they, spent tens of millions of dollars. Same thing was true at eBay. That's why they were like, oh, we're just, it will be a marketplace like Craigslist where, we just don't get involved. But then you start to have really bad, ugly scenarios that emerge, and nobody's thought through it. And then it gets in the courts, and it's a mess. And then it really starts to scare people away from your ecosystem. And that's when people realize they need to build a system like this. So I think it's the right time to think about it now before the volumes get really out of control. But, that's my perspective.
Thanks so much for that. There have been some questions around terminology. So, as our expert for today, can you help us clarify them? What's the difference between dispute resolution and arbitration and mediation? Because right now in the space, everyone calls this arbitration, and I'm like, it's not arbitration.
Yeah, well, I can describe the difference. Dispute resolution is sort of the catch-all phrase. So anytime you have a disagreement between 2 parties, you can resolve that through dispute resolution. Now, there's lots of different forms of dispute resolution. I mean, Amy, if you and I have a dispute, we could decide to play a game of checkers, and whoever wins gets the money. Like, that is a form of dispute resolution. But essentially, what you want to do is you want to structure a process. So you can say, as we say in the dispute resolution field, we fit the forum to the fuss. So we want to provide appropriate resolution processes for different types of disputes. Now, mediation and arbitration are 2 different types of dispute resolution. Mediation, essentially, most people know what negotiation is. Negotiation is where there are 2 parties and they communicate directly with each other, and they come up with a resolution that's mutually acceptable. Now, the problem, we negotiate all the time. We negotiate with our business partners and our kids and, our coworkers and our spouses. But the thing about mediation is it is assisted negotiation. So a third party neutral who's uninvolved in the dispute, that third party neutral then joins the 2 negotiators and assists them in coming up with a resolution that both of the negotiating partners will agree to. So it's a facilitative dispute resolution process where no outcome is achieved that the parties don't explicitly agree to. Arbitration is different. Arbitration is a little like Judge Judy. In the U.S., everybody knows Judge Judy. It's like a court. It's where the 2 parties agree to have a third party come in who is neutral, but will listen to both sides and then will render a binding decision. So you can have non-binding arbitration, you can have binding arbitration, but essentially most arbitration is binding.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, I think maybe you might, I don't know, it helps for people to see you, but I think your video is starting to lag a little bit, so I'll let you decide. And I'll give you a minute to lower your shades. Okay, there we go. Actually, Colin, do you want to cut your video? Oh, it's because you were muted. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. Bandwidth challenges.
Perfect.
So I don't know how much you got of that, but mediation is facilitative and voluntary. Arbitration is binding and mandatory. So the courts are like arbitration, and mediation is kind of like what you do like in a divorce situation. Both sides have to agree to any outcome for it to be binding.
Perfect. Colin, I know you've had a lot of experiences with dispute resolution around the world, including China and some other countries. Can you talk about cultural differences that these systems should take into account when building a dispute resolution system?
Absolutely. So dispute resolution always plays out within a local legal regime. So what we found is dispute resolution, there are forms of mediation and arbitration all over the world, but they operate a little bit differently because people negotiate differently in different regions of the world. So I just visited China last year, and they've created something called the Internet Court in Hangzhou. And essentially, they do use dispute resolution in advance of a formal decision from the court, but they structure it a little bit differently. They do a non-binding evaluative process initially. So when you come into the court, you can ask for a very quick decision from a third-party neutral arbitrator that says, I think a fair outcome to this case would be this. Now, it's non-binding. So if either of the parties disagree with that initial assessment, then they can begin essentially a negotiation and mediation process. Now, that's not the way it works in the United States. Most of the time in the United States, dispute resolution processes begin with negotiation. And then if the parties feel like they can't reach an agreement, then they invite in a mediator who will assist the negotiation. And if they can't reach an agreement in conjunction with the mediator, it will go to an evaluative process, usually a binding evaluative process like arbitration. So you can see the components are the same, but the dispute resolution flow is a little bit different. And that has to do with cultural expectations and efficiency. Most of the time, if you're in a mediation and you have a third-party neutral mediator, you don't want that mediator to become the arbitrator, because the parties may say things to each other in front of the mediator as part of a negotiation that they don't want the arbitrator to know should it go to an evaluative outcome. But now what we're seeing in the United States is more use of something called MEDARB, where it's an expedited process where the mediator at some point becomes the arbitrator. And it's important that the parties know that up front, so they know that this is a MEDARB process, so that they don't say something to them in front of the mediator that they later regret telling the mediator. So there are all these different dispute systems designs. And when we say, again, we're trying to fit the forum to the fuss, we want to design an appropriate resolution process that will work for the target dispute type and for the cultural environments within which it will operate. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Here's another question, scalability, right? The current dispute resolution and arbitration layer as proposed is very human-powered at the moment,
Right.
and there are concerns about its lack of scalability. Can you speak on that topic?
Absolutely. So at eBay and PayPal, when I left, we had about 250 million users, and we were resolving about 60 million disputes per year. Now, the question was, we only had 25,000 employees, so there was no way that we could manually resolve those disputes, and they were relatively low value. So we worked hard at getting to the point where algorithms could handle the vast majority of that volume. And we built essentially a diagnosis process, which was an intake process where we would ask people about the nature of the dispute, and we would combine that with data that we had about that transaction. And sometimes we could resolve the dispute in that diagnosis phase. If that didn't work, then we put them into a negotiation environment where the two parties would work directly with each other, assisted by an algorithm. And we were able to resolve a good number of cases there as well, again, by providing information to the parties and indicating what we thought were appropriate outcomes. Now, if you couldn't work it out in the diagnosis and negotiation phase, we did have a mediation process for a small number of cases. And then we had an arbitration. Essentially, it wasn't an arbitration process. We called it an evaluation process, because we did provide an outcome. A customer service rep from eBay would decide the case, but it wasn't enforceable in a court like an arbitration is. The word arbitration implies a degree of legal enforceability. And these eBay outcomes were enforceable on eBay, but anybody could appeal them in a court if they wanted to, even though nobody did because the value of the transactions were so low. Now, when you get to the question of scalability, the first two modules that I described, diagnosis and negotiation, that's all software. The only people that are participating in that resolution process are the disputants, what we call party A and party B. And then they work with a software program that tries to facilitate and get resolution. We got to the point at eBay where 50% of the 60 million disputes reported to us were resolved between the parties by mutual agreement, and 90% of the 60 million were resolved without a human third party. So it was only software plus the disputants. And the reason why that was so important was because the last 10%, which is still a lot of disputes, it was 6 million disputes, those were the cases that most required human attention. But we needed to do the triage in software. We used to call it at eBay drinking from the fire hose. So what we needed to do was use software to reduce the volume to the point where we could manage it. And so now, and again, that was 2011 when I left eBay. We've refined that even further. We've gotten to the point where now algorithms in some of our cases can resolve 99% of transactions. Again, through a combination of facilitation and problem diagnosis. Now there's a lot of people who are working on using technology to provide evaluative outcomes, where it would be like software would decide a case. And a good amount of the time you can use policies to do that. And people are experimenting with artificial intelligence, machine learning to do that last evaluative layer. Then we'll be able to use software for all of the different phases. But I think, that's the key with scalability, is providing diagnosis, providing clear policies, providing negotiation environments that are all in software, and that can scale into the billions of disputes, no problem.
So Colin, and this is not necessarily the EOS community, although some of the sentiment comes over, but basically in 2016, there was this situation called the DAO, and that was over on the Ethereum network. And from that whole situation, a philosophy came about, and that philosophy was code is law. And so a lot of people in that particular community say, so long as we agree to something beforehand and we memorialize that in a smart contract or through some piece of technology, that's what should rule. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I was part of the Center for Technology and Society at Stanford when Larry Lessig was there. And I think Larry wrote the book, Code is Law. I think that we are moving towards an environment where the judicial enforcement, meaning jurisdiction, judges, jails, police, the justice system of the future is not dependent on any of that. The internet and virtual currencies and smart contracts, they are going to work the way the internet works, meaning you don't need to figure out what laws apply. You don't need to figure out how to harmonize different legal jurisdictions, because it is true, the code transcends all of that and everybody's bought into that structure. But I think it is it runs counter to human nature to say that people are just going to be able to agree to these smart contracts, and if any dispute arises, they'll say, oh, well, I'm bound by the smart contract. So, that's just not, there are always edge cases. There's always things that are not considered in contracts that are put together. There's misunderstandings. If you look at the legal system, what is the legal system created to do? It is created to prevent, manage, and resolve disputes. And we can say that contracts are binding and there's no disputes. But unfortunately, that's just not the way that it works, because one party is going to say, wait, you didn't live up to your obligations under this contract. And the other one's going to say, oh, yes, I did. And there's going to be a disagreement. And if we don't have a mechanism for resolving that, it's going to very quickly undermine trust in the overall system. So it's not for 99% of contracts. It's actually maybe less than 1% of these agreements are going to make use of this mechanism. But there's a benefit from creating this redress mechanism to the other 99% that never use it, because it provides this layer of trust, which means people say, I know if someone screws me over or lies to me or misrepresents me or hornswoggles me, I know I have access to this process, and that lets me work through some of these edge cases. So I agree with code is law. I 100% agree with it. But I think we have to look at what is law. And that's why online dispute resolution, which also works the way the internet works, it lets you disperse all of these redress processes into the code and build a system that's part of code. I think ODR is perfectly in line with code is law, but it's very I think that it's misleading to say if the code is good enough, we won't need online dispute resolution. I think that that's not true.
During your time at Modria, there were a lot of companies, both in Silicon Valley and otherwise, that would come to consult you. Some of them built their own internal dispute resolution systems. Some of them outsourced it to you guys or to other folks.
Sure.
What are the things that people should take into account when deciding, oh, do we just build our own internally, or do we have a third party build it?
Yeah, this is the classic build versus buy challenge. The benefits of build are you totally control it, you own it, you can evolve it however you want to. You don't have any external dependencies, which can be great. But on the other hand, it can be very expensive. You often don't necessarily know what you're doing. You sort of learn by doing. And when you make decisions, early architectural decisions, it's hard to unring the bell later. Most building a software platform is a lot of one-way gates. And once you go through the gate, it locks behind you and you can't go back and reconsider it. So I know at PayPal, before I got there, in the very early days of PayPal, they built a resolution process. And there were some limitations to the choices that they made, but they scaled so quickly that they were never able to go back and revise it. The other challenge is you have a limited number of dev days, and to take those days and put them into a dispute resolution process, where people may say, well, hey, I'd rather spend these dev days on these other features which enable an expansion of the market or add more value to the users. It just kind of means that the resolution process sometimes can get ignored, and needed changes take a long time because other priorities keep displacing those changes. So the benefit of outsourcing it to a mature platform like the one, so I mentioned I ran Modria, that technology we spun out of eBay. So we got a license to eBay's technology, and then we refined it for 6 years at Modria. Now it's been further refined at Tyler. And there are other ODR platforms. Let me be clear. There's more than 100 ODR providers around the world right now, and they all have their own software. Of course, again, I'm biased. I think mine is the best, but there are other good platforms out there too. It's just you have the benefit of an organization that's totally devoted to online dispute resolution. They're adding features to it all the time, and they're refining it, and it doesn't cost any dev days from the core organization's budget. So that's why we've talked with companies like Airbnb and Walmart and lots of large e-commerce global networks. They are interested in outsourcing this and using a platform that's kind of proven and scaled. So I think it's an important decision for EOS as well. You got a lot of smart coders out there. Maybe people want to tackle, and I think I'm happy to help out. I mean, we are working with courts now who are building their own systems, and I'm advising them. So there are definitely best practices and design advice that can be gleaned, from ODR.info, which is the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, other peer ODR projects, if somebody wants to do it themselves. But it's kind of like, I always say this to people when they build a web service. It's not like you build it and you're done. You don't write the end. Okay, great. You have to maintain it. You have to keep it. You have to evolve it constantly. The protocols are changing. So you need to make sure that you have the resources not only to build it and launch it, but also to maintain it over the long term. So
let's talk about that design advice. What principles should these systems be taking to account when they're being architected? Let's talk about design advice.
Sure. Well, I think that you want to, especially initially, people always talk about lean startup. You want to build your MVP, build your minimum viable product. You don't want to build something that's overly complicated. What I see again and again, no offense, Amy, is the lawyers take over. And lawyers like to build very heavy procedural processes, that are lots of rules, lots of structure, and it mimics the court design. And that's why you see people immediately swing to the arbitration model, because that's what lawyers are comfortable with. Okay, we're both going to present our evidence, and then we're going to have a big, third party come in and evaluate the evidence and ask questions and then render a decision. Well, that's fine, but if you build a very heavy system like that, it can be quite complicated to architect it. And then later you realize, hey, we didn't think about these kinds of cases. They're not a good fit with the system we've designed. And then you're reluctant to undo the work that you've done. So I like the idea of a minimum viable product because you want to learn by doing. And once you start to get cases in, then you can start to see the overall mix of different types of matters that you're going to be wrestling with. And it might be that a certain percentage of your cases are relatively straightforward. And then you can build an expedited process for those that doesn't go through the heavy duty process. So that's why I like this notion of filters, where you have software, very streamlined. And one of the things we found at eBay was people would rather lose their dispute quickly than win their dispute and have it take a long period of time. And on eBay, that was 12 days. If a dispute took longer than 12 days to resolve, people were more frustrated. Even if they won and they got their money back, they were more frustrated than if they lost on day one. And the reason why is because we're talking about relatively low dollar value disputes. If you have to worry about this thing for 12 days, what's going on? They're asking questions. You have to submit evidence. You're waiting. You don't have your money back. Eventually, your frustration with the process overwhelms your satisfaction at getting a quick resolution. So I think it's very important to build lightweight, fast resolution processes where every case is resolved as quickly as it possibly can be resolved. And what we found is early resolutions are the most satisfying for the parties, and they build the greatest trust. So that's another reason why you want to keep your system simple. But my advice would be don't jump to the evaluative piece and then just start jamming cases into the evaluative piece. Look into some of these early software-driven processes like diagnosis and direct negotiation, because that's where you get better outcomes, more durable outcomes, and you achieve trust.
Great, fantastic. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to the community. What questions do you guys have?
Eve.
I'm the only one with the camera on, so I'm the only one who can raise my arm and you can see it. Thank you very much,
But
Colin.
if anyone does want to raise their hand, you can do so on Zoom. You just have to click the button down there. But go ahead.
Thank you very much, Colin. That's really good answers, and clearly you're very knowledgeable of all of this, and we need that voice of reason. I think we've had these calls now. Amy's facilitated, I think this is a third or fourth call that she's facilitated, and it's always good to just delve deeper into ODR. My question would be, in terms of designing a system, what are the challenges that you faced when designing these systems? Something that, like a lessons learned that you learned either from your past experience at Mojia or even prior to that?
Well, there's a lot of lessons that I've learned. I think people often feel like they can pay these problems away, especially when you've got EOS has, raised an enormous amount of money. And fundamentally, a lot of these disputes are going to be transactional disputes between strangers. And there's a dollar amount on the table. And what I have heard again and again from e-commerce people who have a lot of money say, oh, well, if anybody has a dispute, we'll just cover it. Like it's only a small percentage of our transactions. So why don't we just, if somebody says, essentially you take the bullet. So say you have two partners that engage in a smart contract. They have a dispute over the amount. They can't reach an agreement. So there's always an incentive to come in and say, okay, well, why don't I just pay out one side? So you can keep the money and then you can take the money too. And then, we've resolved the dispute. And the point that I want to make, I've learned this over a long period of time, is that does not resolve the dispute. Yes, the two parties both get the money and then they can walk away. But there are a lot of perverse incentives when you design a system like that. One of which is they say, hey, all we have to do is file a dispute and then somebody's going to step in and then they're going to, pay us off. So then you start to get perverse behavior where people start to engage in riskier transactions because they know that they have this safety net where somebody's going to come in and pay them off. It also, when you have a dispute with a bad actor and you feel like they've engaged maybe even in some fraudulent behavior and misrepresenting to you, or they intentionally swindled you, if a third party comes in and says, oh, we're so sorry you had this experience, here's your money. You say, okay, well, thanks for my money, but what about that guy? What about the bad actor? I mean, nobody did anything to address that. So that guy's now going to go off and do that to other people. And how do I know that's not going to happen to me? And then you have an incentive to say, well, if everybody is doing this, if everybody's engaging in this bad behavior, I'd be a fool not to, right? So this is what I mean by trust. Online dispute resolution at eBay lived in a department called trust and safety. And I think we were the first e-commerce company to create a trust and safety division. And we did a lot of thinking about what is trust and where does trust come from. Trust is a very precious commodity. And there are some websites out there that are trusted, even though they shouldn't be trusted, Facebook. But, and then there are other websites out there that are not trusted, even though they should be trusted. And they've worked really hard to establish security protocols, and they've got good dispute resolution. So trust is it's based on perception. But what we found is there are 3 legs to the trust stool. One is feedback, reputation. If somebody is a bad actor and they take advantage of other people, there needs to be a system where people can report them and indicate this is a bad actor. I had a bad transaction with this person. They took advantage of me, so that future transaction partners can know to avoid them. And that is an incentive for people to engage in good behavior. The second leg of the stool is resolutions, what we're talking about, ODR. You have to provide a fast and fair resolution every time there's a problem. Because if people feel like they can't get those resolutions, then you start to get these perverse behaviors. They don't trust the marketplace. And the third leg of the stool is fraud investigations. If there are bad actors, malevolent actors that are engaging in criminal or fraudulent behavior, you have to find those people and you have to cut them out of the marketplace and potentially refer them to law enforcement. If you don't have those 3 legs, then over time, what you find is trust is undermined. And there are plenty of websites out there that didn't put adequate attention into trust, and they lost the trust. And then even later, they did the right things, and they came in and they fixed the problems, but it was already too late because the trust was gone. So I think that's the message that I want to communicate to you guys. ODR is not something that lives in a vacuum. It needs to be part of a broader trust building mechanism that involves these other components. And I think there's always an incentive at the beginning of the creation of a system like this to just say, well, buyer beware, caveat emptor. We're not a court. We're just a mechanism. We're a tool. And this kind of libertarian approach. And eBay started out that way, but we very quickly realized that's not the way that it works. And if you look at the people that are winning in e-commerce, it's companies like Amazon, who thought about this from day one and have put trust as their number 1 priority. And eventually the network effect has driven all of the volume to Amazon because they've prioritized trust. So, I guess that's the main message that I would communicate, is this is part of that overall trust and safety strategy.
Thank you, Colin. Amy, can I ask a follow-up to Colin's question? Is that okay? You muted.
Oh, I said, sure, make it quick because I know Stephen has a question.
Okay, I'll make it quick. In terms of paying for this, Colin, so I know that eBay, who pays for this if it does get further down the line? Because one of the questions we ask often in EOS right now with the current system is who pays the arbitrators, or who pays for this system, or where does the money come from to maintain this type of system?
Well, that's the key question as you guys design all these different virtual currency networks, right? Is it going to be the payers who pay? Is it going to be the app developers who pay? Where's the money coming from? Now at eBay, the way that, for instance, at eBay, all dispute resolution, we built something called the Resolution Center, which was a console where any user on either eBay or PayPal could file a dispute and then get it tracked all the way to resolution. So every user had access to this Resolution Center where all of it was managed. And it was all provided for free. So you say, okay, well, how did we pay for that? What essentially eBay did was, on every transaction, they took 1/10 of a penny and they put it into a dispute resolution fund. So it was a tiny amount of money on a per case basis, because as I mentioned, 99% of transactions never have a dispute. But what we did was we built up that fund through all the transaction volume. And then when we built dispute resolution, we paid for it out of that fund. So there was this reserve of resources to fund. And all trust and safety kind of worked that same way. And we also worked very closely also with the customer support team, So the customer support team, they were resolving disputes as well, but through a different channel. So they also were funded in a similar mechanism. So you think about this as essentially a cost of each individual transaction, and you spread it out across all transactions, and then you essentially have a fund to pay for it. But I think you don't want to build a system that says, okay, if you have a dispute, you can come file it and it's going to cost you $20 to file the dispute. What we saw originally, that was the way eBay worked when they built their first online dispute resolution process. To file a dispute, you had to pay money. And that generated frustration because most people that were filing disputes felt like they were victims and they didn't want to have to pay in order to, have the perpetrator of the crime be brought to justice. It sort of adds insult to injury. So if it's possible to build that kind of fund, then you see it as a cost of the overall network.
Thank you very much.
No problem, Eve. Thank you for the great questions. All right, Stephen.
Stephen, you had a question.
Hey, thanks, Colin. I just wondering, what do you see the difference between ODR for traditional online business like eBay, PayPal versus a blockchain like EOS? Because there's no central body like eBay or PayPal.
That's right.
When you're setting up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think eBay was a marketplace for items. You purchase things from eBay, even though eBay didn't have any warehouses. I mean, all eBay was doing was connecting people, and then they were engaging in the transaction themselves. PayPal was a payments company, so that's a little bit different. There are aspects of EOS that look more like a payments company, but in a sense, it's almost more like Visa and MasterCard. It's sort of a payments network where, Visa and MasterCard, they have what they call the chargebacks process. And the chargebacks process, essentially, one of the things that's very important to think about is power imbalances. And what we found in the consumer protection context is consumers have much less power than merchants. Merchants are repeat players. They may have thousands of disputes a year. They know how to navigate these processes. They know the rules. Consumers, what we found at eBay was 95% of the disputes filed on eBay were filed by people who only filed one dispute a year. And the vast majority of consumers, let me be clear, on eBay didn't file any disputes in a year. But what that means is consumers, this is their first time in the process. They don't know their rights. They don't have legal counsel. They haven't gone through this 1,000 times. So you have to design a system that essentially compensates for that power imbalance. Now, if you look at what the credit cards have done, the credit card chargeback process essentially gives all the power to the consumer, because the consumer can unilaterally call the number on the back of their credit card and reverse a payment purely on their own recognizance at any point. Now, if they do that too many times, if they file too many chargebacks, then it may be that their card is pulled or their credit limit is dropped. But merchants, really, they can respond to a chargeback, but they can't prevent the chargeback from being filed in the first place. So I think the question for EOS is this a payments network? Is this a payments protocol? Blockchain is very different, as Amy was mentioning, because you write these smart contracts and you put them into the blockchain, and they're unalterable. So, really, you're right. The code is the law. But we have protocols that we've all agreed to follow in participating in this network. So the question is, how do we enshrine online dispute resolution in these protocols and create incentives for the parties to abide by those protocols within the network that we've designed? And I think that is a different design question than somebody like eBay or Amazon or Buy.com or Taobao or Alibaba, because they have a direct relationship with the consumer and they're building their own brand. They're not a protocol so much as a service. And I think that's the difference with EOS. And I think, that's kind of what this committee is tasked with, is thinking about, okay, what's the unique fingerprint of what we're building here, and how would our redress process have to work to fit the forum to the fuss?
Other questions for Colin? Thanks. You can raise your hand on the Zoom panel. I have a question, and this kind of goes back to who pays, right? Because maybe the whole eBay marketplace analogy isn't quite so analogous, given that this layer is more like the internet instead of the marketplace, right? But there are proposals right now that those who are filing disputes should be charged a fee, and those fees should be a percentage of this disputed amount. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know you've tried this out before.
Yeah, if you look at the arbitration providers like JAMS and AAA, and in China it's CTAC or the Hong Kong International Arbitration Council, they do charge contingent fees. So it's based on a percentage of the amount in dispute. And I think the presumption in that design is that the dollar value cases are more complicated than the lower dollar value cases. So it's appropriate for the arbitration administrator to, essentially get a piece. And again, we're talking about a very small piece. If it's $100 million case, the resolution process may cost $100,000 or $150,000. So when you're with that amount of money sloshing around, the parties usually are fine with taking a portion of it to have a fair redress process. I find that in the internet context, people are not often willing to agree to those contingent pricing, where you get a portion of the amount in dispute. Do you have an idea, Amy, what the average dispute value would be for these kinds of EOS disputes?
We don't have that data right now because the network is so young, right? But I have a feeling that it's going to be a lot of tiny microtransactions as opposed to a lot of $100,000 transactions.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's my sense too. We built at PayPal, we had a micropayments dispute resolution process because we were starting to do, 10-cent payments and 20-cent payments for people to get access to online media and things like that. And when you have really low dollar value transactions like that, it's really hard to justify an in-depth dispute resolution process. Why would someone pay, $10 for a resolution process if the amount of their dispute was only $5? It doesn't make any sense, because it would just make more sense for you to save the money and just pay the other side or eat the cost. Now, there is an argument that you want parties to pay a little bit for their resolution process, because then they have some skin in the game. Because it is possible to start a dispute resolution process and the parties just don't take it seriously and they don't participate and they don't respond. The process doesn't have any teeth in it, so there's no impact for the parties just ignoring it. And that is a badly designed online dispute resolution process. One of the number one determinants of the effectiveness of ODR is enforceability. So you've got to have some way for this resolution process to matter. And one of the most successful ODR processes all around the world is what they call the UDRP, the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Protocol, which was set up by ICANN to resolve disputes around domain names. And that process has now been running for, 15, 16 years. It's resolved, hundreds of thousands of disputes. And, these cases, they are cross-jurisdictional. But why is it that process is so effective? It's because if I file a case under the UDRP and I say this domain name is being squatted upon, this is legally my domain name because it's my trademark and this other user is using it inappropriately. If I file that case and the other side doesn't respond, the domain holder doesn't respond, well, then that means I can win that case through the UDRP. And then essentially ICANN can change the domain name database and give me that domain name. They have absolute enforcement power because they control the database of domain names. So that's why the system is so effective, because there's 100% enforcement. Why is it that eBay could build a resolution center and make it work? Well, we run PayPal. So if we think that a buyer deserves a refund, we can go into the seller's PayPal account, take the money, and give it to the buyer, even if the seller disagrees. So that enforceability is a crucial component of the success of these dispute resolution programs. So you're going to need to figure out at EOS, how much of that are you going to be willing to provide? Because then parties will respond, because they know that EOS has enforcement power. And if they don't participate and they lose, there's going to be a negative impact for them. So if you charge that small amount up front, that means, okay, the parties are bought in. And usually what you want to do is you want to split it between the two parties, because then they don't feel like there's a financial incentive to take care of one party versus the other party, because both are jointly funding the mechanism. That's one of the reasons, based on Eve's question, I like the idea of taking a fraction of a penny off of every transaction and putting it into a fund, because then the resources that are funding the maintenance of the ODR process are not associated with any individual user type. And then there's no accusation of bias. There's been accusations of bias in the UDRP program for ICANN because they're funded by complainants. All of the cases are paid for by the people who file the case. So the respondent doesn't have to pay anything. It's only the person that initiates it. And that's one constituency, usually trademark holders. So, there are some important questions of bias and neutrality that need to be considered. And, the finances in particular can warp processes over time if all of the money is coming from one particular type of party.
Eve, you have another question.
Yeah, so Colin, you just mentioned that you have the power, or one of the systems, they have the power in eBay, for example, to go get the money from the merchant, even though the merchant might disagree. Can you elaborate on that in terms of how effective that was at building trust to get new merchants on versus actually losing the merchants that think eBay has power over them, over their accounts, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was fear that merchants were going to say, well, I don't like this. I don't like that a decision could be rendered that I disagree with, and I have to abide by it. Essentially, again, this is different for eBay and PayPal, but when you sign up on eBay and PayPal, you agree in the user agreement to this mechanism that eBay and PayPal have the ability to play this essentially decision-making role. Now, the other thing you have to realize is it's not just about each individual merchant or each individual payer or payment recipient. It's about the whole ecosystem. And merchants want bad merchants to be held accountable. So even though they themselves might not like the possibility that a decision would be rendered that they disagreed with, if the overall process is fair and it's designed in a fair way, and the merchant can look at that process and say, okay, yes, this is a neutral, impartial process, and the decisions that it renders are trustworthy, then later, if a decision is rendered that they don't agree with, they can say, look, I may disagree with the outcome in this particular case, but I previously agreed that the overall process was fair. So procedurally, I believe this process is just, even though I think this individual outcome may not be just. So I think that's one of the things you have to communicate to your merchants, which is this is in your interest. And I would often have really good merchants who never had any disputes. Finally, they had a dispute filed against them and they went mental. They were like, I am a good merchant. Look at my record. I've never had a problem before. And I would say, look, problems are inevitable. It is inevitable that eventually you're going to come up against a problem. And maybe it's not your behavior. Maybe it's the unreasonable behavior of your buyer or your transaction partner. But you know what? The process is just and it's fair, and we're going to go follow. But net, this is good for you. The fact that you've had a low number of disputes is a strong indicator of your trustworthiness in the marketplace and your willingness to follow through on this dispute resolution process and abide by the active system. It's a trustworthy system. It's a fair system. In the beginning, eBay didn't have that trust itself. So how did eBay communicate and how did eBay sell that trust from the very beginning? Because that's similar to where we are in EOS right now. We want to design something, but we don't have that precedent of having that trust. What tips could you give, or what can you think of that would help building that trust from the very beginning? Well, it's a great question. And if you actually go back and look at the early days of eBay, this was a hot debate. I mean, again, eBay was the first global e-commerce marketplace. So a lot of these problems were confronted for the first time at eBay. And there were some people that said, and I know Craig Newmark from Craigslist. You know, I met him. eBay, we actually talked about buying Craigslist at one point, and it was a hot debate. Craigslist made the other choice. You know, Craigslist went the direction of, we are not going to do dispute resolution. We are not going to worry about trust in transactions. We are merely a bulletin board, and people can tack things onto our bulletin board, and we don't vet what they put on our bulletin board. So, that's another approach. But Craigslist became kind of a swamp of bad behavior. And, there's a lot of unsavory stuff that happens on Craigslist. There's tons of fraud on Craigslist. They got in a big trouble because they were doing a lot of, prostitution and things like that. Meg Whitman, when she took over eBay, there was a lot of that sleazy stuff on eBay. And there were people at eBay that said, well, let's just be like Craigslist. We're just an open the porn off the site. We're going to get the drugs off the site. We're going to get firearms off the site. We're going to make this a trusted environment, and we are going to stand behind it and say, if you engage in a transaction, and that was really what made eBay eBay. There were lots of those kind of caveat or marketplaces out there. But eBay took its resources and said, when you buy something on eBay, we're going to stand behind it. So I would say that this is an important conversation for EOS as well. I mean, again, there's always the appeal of the Craigslist model, and Craig Newmark still, to this day, everything's free. Well, why is it free? Because, they don't have to pay for trust and transactions. They don't have to worry about anything. Anybody can stick something on their bulletin board, and that's the way that it goes. And people say to me, why don't you provide ODR for Craigslist? There's so many bad experiences there, people being taken advantage of every day. I said, there's no way to enforce it. You don't know who your transaction partner is. I can't reverse the money. People pay each other in cash, or they do, money transfers that aren't reversible. So there's A, you don't know who's right or who's wrong. B, if you do decide who's right or who's wrong, you can't enforce it because you can't actually make your decision stick. So I think that this is an important, foundational question for EOS to ask. What do you want to be? And I would say that trust is something that could be a very powerful competitive differentiator for EOS. And I don't think that you have to go all out. Step one, you don't have to create a whole court system with the judges and the robes and the gavels and put Amy, up there with a wig on, to decide cases. I don't think that's necessary. I think what you can say is we do have a protocol for addressing this, and we're going to build it out over time. But we do care about when problems arise, we have effective mechanisms. And there are ways to design this. Amy's written a lot about this. You can build in a dispute resolution process. You essentially put a clause into every smart contract that says, if there is a dispute about this, you're going to use this mechanism. And you can use escrow, for instance, which is a very powerful form of dispute resolution. It slows down the frictionless aspect of the marketplace because you do have to get the thumbs up from both parties before the money is released. But that is a mechanism that essentially provides redress in 100% of cases. And that may be a good place to start, for instance. But I just think it's important to address this and think about it. Even if the decision is we're not going to do it, be explicit about that so that parties know that that's the way that when you transact on EOS, you don't have any support system. But I personally think this is a good investment. It's something to think about longer term. And that's why I think this committee is so valuable, to be thinking through these questions. So I hope I answered your question there, Eve. But
you did. Thank you very much, Colin.
All right. Do we have any last questions? It is 60 past the hour. Any last questions?
I know Stephen.
All right.
So he needs to go to bed. I did post 2 links into the chat. So if you want to check out odr.info, that's the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. And the other one is the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, ICODER, which has a list of what we've come up with as principles for ODR systems design. So that's worth checking out as well. And if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. But thank you for having me, Amy. This was a very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you for lending your expertise. Thanks, Colin.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, everyone.